Hello, it's me again, Mark Angko, and I'm here to show you how to implement OpenID on your website. To use OpenID, one can go to the OpenID website at openid.net and click on the button, yes, add OpenID to your site. Then press Get Started. If you are using Drupal, Joomla, or other CMS to create a website, you can use modules and plugins as listed here. For our case, we will be clicking on the libraries link. Here you'll see different libraries that can be used to implement OpenID in different platforms or languages. For my demo, I'll be using the PHP OpenID library. The library contains the needed files for authentication using OpenID and also includes example files to test out. Once the file is downloaded and the contents are extracted, we'll now try to begin implementing OpenID using HTML and PHP. I'm currently using my LAMP-based localhost, and what we need to do first is copy the auth folder inside the archive, which contains the libraries, to the PHP libraries folder on your web server. If ever you copied it on a different place, you should first edit your PHP ini file and put the directory with the includes directive. Once the web server is configured, we will now implement OpenID. What you see here is a basic login form created in HTML. As was shown for OpenID, you only need one text field for the OpenID URL. What we need to do here is to wrap the login form inside the PHP code that will do the OpenID authentication. This PHP code wrapping the login form shows the basic code needed to implement OpenID. This implementation requires three different PHP files. First, the PHP file that will contain the form and the web content. The next is the PHP return form that will handle the pass variables from the provider site where your OpenID was signed up. The last file is the PHP file that containing the page or site where you want to limit access in using OpenID. Let's go to the first form. The first form you see here wraps the login form inside the PHP code. The first thing it needs to do is to check if there is input on the OpenID URL field, and the next thing is to include the needed files. First, the consumer.php file, which include the needed directives to authenticate the user. And the next is the filestore.php file, which includes the storage directives for the authentication details. Once the session is started, the variables for the consumer and the storage file is created, and then the inputted OpenID URL is checked for consistencies. Next, the authentication details is passed on to the provider site, which also includes the return path of the consumer. So let's now go to the next code. The next code will be the one to handle the response from the provider side. And the first thing it will do is check the completed response from the provider, and then check if the authentication is a success or a failure, and then pass the data to the session variable. So after this, you will be redirected to the restricted page. Now on to the restricted.php file. As you can see, it only requires a snippet at the top, which checks for the authentication session variables and as set in the OID return.php. And restricted.php therefore can any be part of your site which would require authentication. All you need to do is to place the environment variable checking on the top of the HTML of the PHP file and place the path of the page on the OID return.php file. So now I'll be showing you a demo of how the implementation would work. In this login form, then we should first put in our OpenID URL. So here is my OpenID URL, and then as you can see, it will redirect you to the provider site. We'll check for your authentication. So here I'm in my OpenID, and I will just put in my password. And once done, I'll just check continue. You can see there, I'll then be redirected to my set restricted page, restricted.php file. So that's it. I hope you enjoy my demo and try OpenID. Thank you.